Hello and welcome to the first meeting of the Aston Interpreter Network. Because of a technical hitch that happened on the day of the original presentation, I was unable to show you all of the slides that I had ready. So I'm recording this so that you can now see the original presentation as it was meant to be. Today I'm going to focus on the theme of politeness and impoliteness in public service interpreting, and what interpreters should do when they hear polite expressions, rudeness, and even swear words in an interpreter-mediated event. You probably didn't think that you were tuning in to hear me talking about the recent final of the World Cup or the latest episode of the TV series Happy Valley, but that's just what I'm going to do to illustrate my point. Firstly, I'd like to show you a 3-minute extract from the BBC One series of Happy Valley, and it might be a good idea if you have a pen and paper to hand. So it's probably a good idea if you have some context to help you to understand this scene and why I've chosen it. A coercive and violent husband who is called Rob has just assaulted his wife, who's called Jo, after he found illegally obtained prescription drugs in her bedroom drawer. The husband, Rob, has just called the police, and a female police sergeant arrives and proceeds to question Jo about how she obtained the drugs. As the scene unfolds, the police officer is also seen recounting the story of what has happened to her sister back home afterwards. So it does jump back and forth from her home to the scene of the husband and wife. As you watch this 3-minute extract from Happy Valley, which is on BBC One iPlayer, try and notice the following things. For example, the facial expressions on the 3 people in the room, particularly that of the police officer, the demeanour and behaviour of the police officer, how she speaks, whether she uses expressions of politeness or otherwise in her speech to Rob's wife, Jo. And if she does, see if you can spot the words that she uses to achieve this and work out her motive for using the words and the effect of using them. Luckily, there are subtitles on the iPlayer extract, so it should make the task a bit easier for you. And although this extract is in English, we can easily imagine a situation in which Jo doesn't speak English and an interpreter is present. So, the effect of the politeness strategies used by the police officer are really quite remarkable. She uses an informal greeting, "Hiya, love." She apologises to Jo by saying for the arrest by saying, "I'm sorry, love, I'm going to have to arrest you." "I am sorry, love, I'm going to arrest you." She uses familiar and affectionate modes of address such as love and sweetie, and she shows solidarity with Jo by saying, "No one's here to humiliate you. I'm not going to cuff you." The officer ultimately is aware that Rob is a coercive partner because she can see that he doesn't allow his wife to answer the questions that she puts to Jo. And also, she's aware that Rob is coercive because she can see the bruises on Jo's arms. And she conveys this awareness to Rob by her facial expressions and the fact that she ignores him or stares disapprovingly at him when he asks or answers the questions that the police officer has put to Jo, instead of allowing Jo to answer for herself. So because of the extremely sensitive situation, she takes the utmost care to speak to Jo with gentleness, kindness, respect and politeness. And she does this by using several tactics, the tactics that I have put on the slide. in the end, the police officer knows that she's going to have to arrest Jo in order to be able to interview her in the absence of her coercive and dangerous partner, Rob. So, if any of these expressions, or as we call them, politeness markers, were to be omitted by the interpreter, then the effect of that omission on the encounter between the police officer, the violent and coercive husband, and the coerced wife would be to create a much more formal, more intimidating, more confrontational, less kind, less respectful, and less polite atmosphere. So the police officer achieved what she wanted to achieve by showing solidarity with Jo, physically removing Jo from the dangerous situation that she was in, by arresting her and thus enabling her to speak more freely in Rob's absence, and doing all of this without waking the children, without disturbing the sleeping children, or incurring more violence from Rob, either towards his wife or even towards the police officer herself. All this by using very few words and very interesting facial expressions. So now let's turn to impoliteness, rudeness, and swearing, which is the other side of the coin from politeness. Below you can see a photo of Mbappé, the French striker, who famously missed a goal in the World Cup final between Argentina and France in the recent World Cup match. Now, I've only used this photo as an example because obviously there's no particular connection between swearing, Mbappé, and public service interpreting, but the photograph captures him at the very moment that he utters a very commonly used French swear word, which is putain. Of course, we couldn't hear him say that because of the roar of the crowd. But when you look at the live footage of the World Cup, it's clear that that's what he said. But what does the word putain mean? Now, the literal meaning of putain is whore, W-H-O-R-E. But in the English language, when we swear, we never use that expression. So the exact equivalent of putain in English would be fuck or fucking hell. So what I'm trying to illustrate is the fact that swearing is highly culture-specific and language-specific, as well as being highly context-dependent, and any swearing needs careful research and consideration before being interpreted into another language. But you might say, well, why should we bother to interpret swearing at all when we hear it during interpreting? Couldn't we just say, oh, he's swearing, and leave it to the service provider's imagination? When I used to interview applicants for the Diploma in Public Service Interpreting course, one of the questions that they had to answer for me during the interview, my standard question was, what would you do if a service user swears during an interview with a police officer? And it was very interesting because the applicants usually gave a range of different answers. Some of them said, oh, I wouldn't interpret the swearing at all. It would give a bad impression of the service user to the service provider. And others would say, no, I wouldn't interpret the swearing at all. I never use those words myself, and I would be really embarrassed to hear them and use them myself. Others would say, well, I'd simply tell the service provider that the service user is swearing without referring to the actual swear words themselves. And others would say, well, it depends on the context. If it's a really formal setting like a courtroom, then I wouldn't interpret it. But if it's in a less threatening formal context, I would interpret it. So, for example, in an office. And occasionally you would get people who would say, very occasionally, I would interpret all the swear words as best as I could into the English language. But now let me show you extracts from 2 documents that I have here. Whenever I train public service interpreters, our first training session is always about how to introduce yourself. And I show the trainees these 2 documents. The first one is an extract from the Code of Professional Conduct, in the National Register of Public Service Interpreters. And this Code of Conduct I've extracted the relevant detail. In section 5.5 on 5.4 on interpreting, it says practitioners, and that means interpreters, shall interpret truly and faithfully what is uttered without adding, omitting, or changing anything. The second document that I have here is the Interpreter's Introduction, which I developed together with an academic interpreting colleague, Jane Straker, many years ago. This last document, this second document, is really a statement of intent, which needs to be read out quite formally, I think, before any interpreter-mediated interview begins or interaction begins. Because if that isn't done, the participants have no idea how you're going to work, what you might need from them, how they can accommodate your needs, or what the protocol is. So the reason that I've highlighted number 2, the second sentence in red, relates precisely to the topic of today's meeting, which is about interpreting politeness and impoliteness. Because we know that if public service interpreters omit to convey the tone of voice, the politeness markers, the terms of respect, rudeness and swearing, then both the service user and the service provider will receive what I call a censored version of what was said, contrary to the interpreter's code of conduct that's set out for registration with the National Register of Public Service Interpreters. And those omissions will in turn produce a different effect upon the participants, and that effect might influence the service provider's perception of the service user and any decisions which are made about him or her. So finally, let's just look briefly at what the research shows us about interpreting politeness in the very formal public service context of a courtroom, which is where most of the research on politeness has been carried out. Well, I myself carried out research and observation of 21 magistrates' courtrooms in Birmingham and London a few years ago, and I found that markers of politeness were routinely omitted by the court interpreters that I observed. Courts are obviously a very formal place where politeness and respect play a very important part in what is effectively an adversarial situation. When I interviewed lawyers, and this is what they said to me about politeness in court, and the purpose of this extreme politeness in court. It emphasises the impartiality of the court. It reinforces the concept of equality of arms for the prosecution and defence. It reassures defendants that they're going to receive a fair hearing. It signals the equality of witnesses and defendants before the law, and it maintains the authority of the judge or magistrate who is presiding. Now, Susan Berk Seligson, who is an American researcher, carried out extensive and groundbreaking observation of interpreted court interaction using experimental data with jurors and real trial cases. And she found that the use of polite speech gives a witness an enhanced image in the perception of those who are listening to the testimony, that is, of course, the jurors. And conversely, she also found that the absence of politeness causes jurors to perceive a witness as, interestingly, less convincing and less truthful. So I think that's a vital piece of research, and I would very, very strongly urge you to read that book. Absolutely fascinating. Now, Sandra Hale is an Australian academic, but she's also an extremely experienced interpreter. And she has written extensively on various aspects of omission and addition in interpreting. She shows us that swearing in particular can present real problems for interpreters because they may not be prepared to, in her words, quickly produce a rendition that carries the same force as the original, unless they have been prepared for it in training. And this shows the importance of making a personal study of swearing and swear words in both the interpreter's working languages, together with translations that can be referred to quickly when that need arises. So, although two of the settings for this research are courtrooms, I think it's very easy to generalize these conclusions and this research and to see how polite and impolite speech does affect the climate of any interpreted interaction, whether it's in the courtroom, the doctor's surgery, or the benefits office. And so going back to that vital interpreter's introduction, this is why it's so important to be aware of that fact and to interpret it, to interpret everything that's said. And just to go back and finish with that second sentence that I highlighted in red earlier, I'll interpret everything you say. And I usually get trainees to emphasize that word, everything. I'll interpret everything you say. If there's something you don't want me to interpret, please don't say it. Thank you for listening, and I'll be very interested to hear about any of your comments. Here's the references that I mentioned during my talk, and some suggestions for further reading also. So thanks once again for listening to this talk, and if you have any questions or comments, or if I've touched on anything that you'd like me to follow up for a future session, please let us know, and we'll look forward to seeing you all at the next Aston Interpreter Network meeting. Bye-bye.